Good evening, my friends, and welcome. It is Sunday night, May the 9th, and I'm Glenn Rawson, and it's Mother's Day. I welcome you. I thank you for joining me. But I have to say right off the top, you have to know that I've been worried about this devotional ever since I planned to do one, because I recognize that as a man and on Mother's Day and talking about mothers, it's like walking across hot coals. I don't want to hurt anybody. I don't want to administer any guilt. I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want to bring up any sensitive feelings. I don't want to do anything tonight except edify and comfort and inspire. And most of all, to all the mothers or mothers that want to be, thank you for everything that you're doing. Just thank you. So I'll begin in just a moment. I wanted to let you know that History of the Saints on television on KSL will not be on this next Sunday, preempted because of sports, but it will be on what would that be, the 23rd, 2 weeks from today, 10 o'clock in the morning on KSL. History of the Saints will be on again. I also wanted just to let you know, remind you one more time, that our next Knowing Joseph seminar with Michael Wilcox, Heidi Tucker, Robert Millett, myself, that will be on August 14th at This Is the Place Heritage Park. And if you're curious or want to reserve a spot for that, send an email to Dennis Lyman. Annie will have his email address, or if Dennis is listening, he will put it in the notes for you so that you can get in touch with him and save your spot. All right. Now, to begin with, and I wasn't planning to do this until I started working on putting this script together, I thought maybe it would be appropriate. I got to make sure that I'm okay with Annie. Okay. That I started off by talking about Jesus and his mother. The relationship between Jesus and his mother, Mary, in the King James Version of the Bible is questionable. There's several interactions that the four synoptic gospels write about, or the synoptic gospels write about, is questionable at best. But when you consider their relationship as it is portrayed in the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, the relationship between Jesus and his mother takes on a whole new light. I'll begin with just this story, and usually I emphasize something different, but tonight I want to talk about that relationship. There is great meaning sometimes in what appears to be the most mundane. The beginning of Jesus' miracles was the turning of water into wine. There was a wedding at Cana of Galilee. I've been through the city of Cana, and I've seen where that supposed site is where Jesus turned the water into wine. There's a magnificent church there now. Well, Jesus and his disciples were invited to that wedding. We don't know a lot of the details. So a lot of what happens about who and why and where and how is conjecture. But somewhere late in the festivities, Mary, the Savior's mother, came to him and said, "They have no wine." Based on the brevity of the texts, it seems that it was an implied request. What was not stated in there is, could you do a miracle? Could you do something and provide the wine? Now, Jesus' answer to her in the King James Version of the Bible, "Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come." That's what he said in the King James Version. Listen to that again. "Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come." Now, I don't know how you read it, but the way I hear that is, I can't be bothered with such trivial matters as this. Mine hour is not yet come. Why are you bothering me? I've never liked the way that read. And then one day when reading the Joseph Smith translation, this is how the Lord, through the prophet Joseph, altered those words. he said, "Woman, what wilt thou have me to do for thee? That will I do, for mine hour is not yet come." See the difference in that? Anything you want me to do, I will do, while I can, for mine hour is not yet come. In essence, I will do anything I can for you. Mary turned to the servants and said to them, "Whatsoever he saith unto you, see that ye do it." And with his disciples watching, Jesus asked the servants to fill some nearby water pots. The amount of water in the 6 pots would have been close to 150 gallons, if not more. Evidently, this was a very well-attended wedding feast. Once they'd finished filling them, and without any fuss or fanfare, Jesus said simply, "Draw out now and bear unto the governor of the feast." The servants brought the new wine to the governor of the feast. He tasted it and exclaimed, "Every man at the beginning does set forth good wine, and when men have well drunk, then that which is worse. But thou hast kept the good wine until now." This first miracle passed quietly. There's no evidence that the guests knew anything about what had happened, but the disciples did, and it manifested his glory and strengthened their faith. Moreover, as I've said many times, and especially in Israel, it's no accident that the beginning of the Savior's miracles involved water. When Moses changed water to blood, he proved that God was with him. When he parted the Red Sea, he proved that God was with him. When Jesus turned water to wine, he proved that he was God. That God who controlled the water was God, is God. Now, that reaction of Jesus to his mother is borne out through the rest of the New Testament. Remember, when Mary had searched for him for days in Jerusalem at the age of 12 and he was lost, and she said to him, "Son, why hast thou thus dealt with us? Thy father and I have sought thee sorrowing." And he said to her, "How is it that ye sought me? Knew ye not that I must be about my Father's business?" In other words, why were you looking for me? You knew where I would be, about my Father's business in the temple. But what comes next is what's not very often talked about. Jesus subjected himself and went down with them, notwithstanding what he wanted to do and be about his Father's business. He obeyed his mother and went with her. And of course, the story is always told about Jesus in his hour on the cross, committing her care to John. There's one other reference to Jesus in the Gospels when Jesus was in a home preaching. And the brethren, some of his disciples, come and say, "Thy mother and thy brethren seek thee," or are waiting for you outside. And Jesus in the King James Version says, "These are my mother and my brethren," meaning they're no longer any responsibility of mine. But the Joseph Smith translation adds this, "And Jesus appointed disciples to go and see to her and take care of her." Everything in the Joseph Smith translation reveals a kinder, more sensitive, gentle Son. Not just the Son of God, but the Son of Mary, too. There is a story in the Old Testament. I think I would dare say that this is one of my wife's favorite stories, that to me embodies everything good about motherhood. It's the story of Hannah and Samuel. Now, Hannah considered herself a woman greatly afflicted. She was barren, unable to bear children, and in the culture in which she lived, that was a badge of dishonor. And though her husband loved her dearly and treated her well, still for Hannah there was an ache in her heart that only a child could fill and God could understand. One day on an excursion to the temple at Shiloh, Hannah went before the Lord in fasting and prayer. The record says that she was in bitterness of soul and prayed unto the Lord and wept sore. So anxious was Hannah to bear a child that in her prayer she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thine handmaid, and remember me, and not forget thine handmaid, but wilt give unto thine handmaid a man-child, then I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life. End of quote. 1 Samuel 1:11. As Hannah prayed in the temple, Eli, the priest, watched her. He came over to her, and to him Hannah poured out the anguish of her heart. Whereupon Eli, as the Lord's representative and high priest, moved by the Spirit of God, gave Hannah a promise, saying, quote, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant thee thy petition that thou hast asked of him. End of quote. Hannah was a woman of great faith. With that promise secure in her heart, she went on her way rejoicing and at peace. Not long after, true to the promise of the Almighty, Hannah conceived and bore a son and called his name Samuel, which interestingly enough means heard of God. For 3 years after that, Hannah refused to leave Samuel and leave home. She was attentive to his every need. And then came the day that must have rent her soul. After the appropriate sacrifices were offered, Hannah presented that precious son to Eli at the temple, saying, My Lord, I am the woman that stood by thee here, praying unto the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord hath given me my petition, which I asked of him. Therefore also I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he liveth, he shall be lent to the Lord. End of quote. And so it was. Samuel became a mighty prophet in Israel. And Hannah, that wonderful woman who had craved so dearly the privilege of being a mother, for her faithfulness, she was blessed with 3 more sons and 2 daughters. God keeps his promises. Thank God. And I mean that. Thank God for those women today, though declining in numbers, who still, like Hannah, yearn to be mothers, who still pray to the God of Israel for the privilege of bearing children, who still, once they have them, refuse to leave them for other pursuits, whose hearts are still rent by the great sacrifice of giving those children up to travel to the other side of the world in the service of the Lord. Those mothers, like Hannah, change history, and heaven will honor them forever and ever. End of quote. You okay? I hope I don't say anything wrong. I pray and invite you to pray for the Spirit of the Lord, that these words and these stories will be received in the spirit of love and kindness. And hopefully and prayerfully, something will speak to you that is far beyond me. In the last General Conference, Elder Garrett W. Gong and others mentioned that we have reached an interesting milestone in the church. We've reached that point where there are more single adults in the church than married ones. That news has troubled me as I have thought about it. All of the people out there lonely and alone, with no companion. I feel bad. And if this devotional is the only way I can share some comfort with those that are alone and lonely, then I want to. Especially all those mothers out there who are going it alone, raising children alone. I minister to 2 of them. You are heroes to me. I don't know how you do it. November the 26th, 1836. Austin and Nancy Hammer purchased 96 acres of land just opening up in northern Missouri. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. Contract for the land, improve it, and once it was surveyed, pay only $1.25 per acre. Austin and Nancy worked hard, established a prosperous farm, and supported their growing family. Then, October 30th, 1838, an angry mob attacked the nearby settlement of Haun's Mill. Austin was among those guarding the mill on that day. 8-year-old John, his son, later recalled that day, quote, "I stood in the yard with my mother. Our anxiety, of course, was great as to the fate of the brethren at Haun's Mill, knowing also that my father and uncle had gone there to aid in its protection and assist those of our friends who lived there. We were standing there at exactly at the time this bloody butchery was committed, and of course we were all looking eagerly in the direction of the mill. While in this attitude, a crimson-colored vapor, like a mist or thin cloud, ascended up from the precise place where we knew the mill to be located, and was carried or streamed upward into the sky, apparently as high as our sight could extend. At that hour we had not heard a word of what had taken place at the mill, but as quick as my mother and aunt saw this red, blood-like token, they commenced to wring their hands and moan, declaring they knew that their husbands had been murdered. The day following, John learned that his father and 16 others had indeed been killed, leaving, in John's case, a wife and 6 children. John further said, "The death of my father, Austin Hammer, left our family in a very helpless condition. It would have been an event of sufficient melancholy had he died at home of sickness where his family could have administered to his needs, but to have him cut down in his prime, 33 years of age, and be torn from his family ruthlessly and cruelly, so intensified the gloom which rested down upon our bereaved circle. For a time," he said, "it seemed that no ray of joy would ever be able to penetrate our bosoms again." End of quote. The mob then sent word audaciously that the remaining Latter-day Saints had 10 days to leave the state or be killed. John continued, "The burden of all this preparation and removal on our part rested on Mother. A less healthy and resolute woman could not have had the courage and endurance to grapple successfully with the obstacles that lay in her path. We had to flee, destitute and hunted, because of our religion. My mother at this time was about 32 years old. Well do I remember the sufferings of those days. Our family had 1 wagon and 1 blind horse, and that blind horse had to transport our effects to the state of Illinois. Into this wagon we placed our clothing, bedding, some cornmeal, and what scanty provisions we could muster, and started out into the cold on foot to eat and sleep by the wayside with the canopy of heaven for a covering. The bitter frost and biting winds were less barbarous and pitiless than the demons in human form from whose fury we fled. There was scarcely a day while we were on the road, John said, that it did not either snow or rain. The nights and mornings were very cold for our unsheltered and exposed condition. My mother, he said, seemed to be endowed with fortitude and resolution and appeared to be inspired to devise ways and means whereby she could administer comforts to her suffering children and keep them in good spirits. Her faith and confidence had ever been great in the Lord. But now, when all this weight and responsibility had fallen upon her, with no husband to lean upon, she felt indeed that God was her greatest and best friend. At last, John said, we reached the Mississippi River, and we were indeed happy. We gazed upon the opposite side of the river with hearts overflowing with thanksgiving to our Heavenly Father for reminding us that God ruled the heavens and took cognizance of those conditions of those people on earth. Behind the story of the great massacre at Haun's Mill, the martyrdom at Haun's Mill, is the story of those who in faith went on. Nancy Hammer. I tell you that story because I know that there are some dear women out there who, like Nancy, didn't plan on being alone. And yet, you go forward with God as your friend to raise your children, be a good mother, a good grandmother, and do the best you can in the service of the Lord. Thank you. And once again, in my mind and in my eyes, you are a hero. Now, the brethren, and I've heard it 2 or 3 times in the last little while, commenting on how deep, pure, and perfect is a mother's love. I don't think we would be so audacious as to say that's the case with every mother, but for every righteous, faithful daughter of God, trusted by Him to bring children into this world, that love surely must approach the Savior's love for all of us. I know, and I won't claim to know or understand a mother's love. I only know what I've seen for myself with the women in my life, my daughters, my wife, my own mother. This story seems to say it all when it comes to a mother's love. July 1st, 1856, somewhere on the Overland Trail in Nebraska Territory. About noon on July 1st, 6-year-old Arthur Parker, feverish and ill, sat down to rest by the side of the trail and quickly fell asleep in tall grass. The MacArthur Handcart Company, which I believe was the second or third company to go out, pushed on, unaware that Arthur was asleep in the grass. That is, until the onslaught of a violent and sudden thunderstorm later that afternoon forced the immigrants to stop and set up camp. Well, Arthur was discovered missing, and a search was mounted that lasted the rest of that day and all night long. Meanwhile, storm, thunder, and lightning raged fearfully all night, according to the accounts. The immigrants lay all night in wet clothes until morning and awoke with water running under them in streams. The next morning, 3 men, including Captain MacArthur, Daniel MacArthur, went back and searched again for the lost child, but he was nowhere to be found. The company remained in camp for the day, waiting and drying out, hoping and praying. The morning of the 3rd day, July 3rd, 1856, the company moved on. They had to. Time was precious and food was scarce. They had to move on. Robert Parker determined to go back and look for his son. His wife, Anne, Arthur's mother, whom Robert had once described as, quote, the most beautiful girl in England. She pinned a bright red shawl about his shoulders, telling him that if he found Arthur dead, he could use that shawl to bury him. And if he found Arthur alive, he could use the shawl to signal them. Now, I know you've heard this story, but would you stop for a moment? You mothers and fathers who are or want to be or will someday be. Imagine Robert and Anne's feelings. I can't. Robert turned east and backtracked along the trail, and Anne and their 3 remaining children picked up their handcart, turned west, and followed the company. The camp moved an incredible and exhausting 25 miles that day. Throughout the day, as you can imagine, Anne kept glancing over her shoulder to see if Robert was coming. A camp was made that night. Anne climbed the highest eminence in the area and looked off into the east for a sign, for anything. Consumed by worry, Anne could not sleep. Why? Because the danger of wolves on the Pioneer Trail was real, and we're not talking coyotes. Stories of immigrants devoured by wolves was known to all travelers, and the constant threat of Indians and kidnap. What if Arthur had been taken? On July the 4th, the camp again moved forward another 22 miles, and once again, Anne passed the day vigilant but weary. July 5th, the company remained in camp. Then, Sunday morning, July 6th, 1856, at 8:30 a.m., Anne saw in rays of the rising sun the red shawl and recognized her husband's familiar gait. It is said, quote, the brave little mother sank in a pitiful heap in the sand, and for the first night in 6 nights she slept. End of quote. Diarist Archer Walters witnessed the boy's return and recorded, quote, great joy throughout the camp. The mother's joy I cannot describe. End of quote. Arthur had awakened along the trail to find himself alone. When the storms hit, he took shelter under a tree, spending the night in the open. The wolves found him, surrounded him, and howled, but strangely did not harm him. The next morning, the lad walked 9 miles to the home of a Dutchman, where Robert Parker later found him, and the boy was saved. Thank the Lord for the prayers, the love, and the faith of stubbornly righteous parents. And by the way, just so you know, this is the same Robert Parker who was the grandfather of Robert Leroy Parker, otherwise known as Butch Cassidy. Next story. I shared this story some time back, but I think it bears repeating now. And maybe this story has no application for you, except that most of the women that are listening would shout a hearty, sincere amen. The scripture says, children are an heritage of the Lord. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. Psalms 127, 3 and 4. But have you ever thought, what of millions, billions of mothers who cannot bear the children they long for? Let me explain. Some years back, Debbie and I were touring with a large group in mainland China when a young Chinese woman boarded our bus to serve as our guide. Her English was superb, and her knowledge and understanding of her country and culture were outstanding. We so much enjoyed her teaching. She was articulate and surprisingly outspoken and blunt. At one point, we got her talking about her country's one-child policy. She explained to us that the government, when she was a child, had mandated that couples could have only one child, and that if they chose to have more, there were stiff fines and penalties levied against such parents who dared to so do. Throughout China, at least in the cities, families of more than two children were uncommon. Moreover, it was a cultural tradition to favor boys over girls, and even though it is slowly changing, centuries of tradition yet remain to this day hard to overcome. Boys are still favored over girls. Today, in certain circumstances, couples can be allowed to have a second child, particularly if the first child dies or the first child is a girl. Our guide then explained to us that she had an older brother that she loved very much. We were surprised to learn that this beautiful, capable young woman was a child that almost wasn't. When her parents learned that they were expecting a second baby, they decided against all social norms and pressures that at all costs they would keep her. They faced the scorn and ridicule of their neighbors and the penalties and sanctions imposed by the government. That girl cost them dearly. There were tears and awe among us on the bus as we listened to her describe the sacrifices her parents made to keep her. And even by American standards, it was a huge and costly sacrifice. And that sacrifice was not lost on that young woman. Her gratitude and reverence for her parents was tender and obvious and in great quantity. It became her life's work to honor and support her parents. All they did for her would be given back for as long as they lived. I will never forget her telling us of that day when, with understanding, she asked her mother, "Was I worth it?" And her mother's answer was, "All of it and more." Now, I'm pretty sure that there are women listening tonight, perhaps, who have not been able to have children. And my heart goes out to you. To all of us, have you ever considered how many dear mothers in China, how many millions of mothers in China wanted more children and couldn't have them? Could, but couldn't have them. How many children through the years, all of you, have you mothered but did not give birth to? Think about that. How many children have you mothered but didn't give birth to? I will always be grateful for those women who in love and kindness were like mothers to me and my children. Blessed are they. This next story is for those mothers who mother those who were not their own. I told this story some time back. I repeat it here because it is appropriate. April the 12th, 1847, Elm Grove, Iowa. Sarah D. Armon Pea Rich recorded the following in her diary. Quote, "While here, the boy that was with us, George Patton, was taken very sick with the mountain fever." Now, George Patton was just a boy. His mother had passed away in Nauvoo, and George's father had given him to Charles and Sarah Rich to take with them to the Rocky Mountains. So that's who George is. Sarah continued in her diary, quote, "And on the 22nd of April, 1847, some of the company started on, and the boy that was with us, still very sick." End of quote. The company traveled on until they reached Garden Grove, Iowa. On May 22nd, 1847, Sarah wrote this, quote, our boy, George Patton, still got worse and became as helpless as a babe, was out of his head, and to all appearance could not live. Our beds had to be made down in the tent and were fixed comfortable. For the sick boy, all our family did all they could for him. He had by this time become unconscious. Mr. Rich came to my bed and called to me and wanted to know if I could watch over the boy a while, for he must have a little rest. So I got up and went to the bedside of the sick boy, while my husband and Brother Brownell could have a little rest. They both thought the boy could not possibly live many hours. So I took my seat beside the poor sick boy and began to reason with myself. My reasoning went something like this. I thought to myself, this poor dying boy was put into our charge to watch over the same as one of our own children. Could we give up one of our own children to die without using all the faith within our reach to plead with the Lord to spare the dear one and not take him away from us? This boy had no mother living to plead with the Lord to spare the dear one and not take it to impress it upon me what to do for poor George. He was a good boy, and we all loved him. So when I got up from praying, I was led by my feelings to put a teaspoonful of consecrated oil in his mouth. His tongue was drawn far back in his mouth and was very black, and his breathing rattling and heavy, and his eyes, to all appearance, set in his head. I did not see that he swallowed the oil, so I anointed his face and head with the oil, asking the Lord to bless the same. Then, in a little while, gave him another teaspoonful of oil, asking the Lord at the same time with a humble heart to spare the boy and accept of my feeble efforts on his behalf. I felt, she said, broken-hearted before the Lord. And to my great joy, I noticed that George opened his eyes and looked upon me as though he was astonished. I said, "George, do you know me?" He spoke in a whisper, "Yes." Oh, how glad I felt by this time. Mr. Rich had woken up and inquired how the boy was, saying afterwards that he almost feared he was gone. I said to him, "Come and see." The boy looked at him and smiled, which astonished Mr. Rich so much that he turned to me and said, "What has caused such a change?" I said to him, "Prayer and faith and hope in our Father in heaven." I told my husband what I had done and how humble I felt while praying to the Lord to spare the boy's life. My husband was truly affected and told me the boy's life would be spared to yet be a blessing to me in some future time. And from that time on, Sarah continued, the dear boy continued to mend slowly and got well. End of quote. Well, in later years, the promise of Apostle Charles C. Rich came to pass. George Patton grew to be a man, settled in Payson, Utah, married, raised a family, and prospered. Sarah wrote this, quote, "Many has been the time that he, George, would bring me loads of provisions, butter and groceries, when Mr. Rich would be off on missions to forward the work of the Lord. And when George would help me, he would always say, 'Ma'am,' for that is what he calls me, he would say, 'Ma'am, I owe my life to you, for your faith and prayers saved me from death.'" End of quote. Thank the Lord for those mothers who mother those who are not their own. I, for one, am one of those who has been so greatly blessed by such kindness. Now, I would like to speak to the brethren for a moment on Mother's Day. And no, I'm not going to lecture you about calling your mother or being nice to your mother. That's none of my business. No, I want to thank you for all that you do to make the lives of the mothers a little easier, even if she's not your mother or the mother of your children. I am grateful for those who watch out for my dear mother who is so far away from me. I am grateful to all those who take care and minister as they should. It was May of 1848 when Elisha Groves and his wife, Lucy, set out from the Missouri River in their journey to the valley of the Great Salt Lake. They were among nearly 2,000 people traveling in this huge wagon company of Latter-day Saints, headed for the valleys of the Rocky Mountains. Passing through Indian country, they had been told for their own safety not to stop their wagons and become separated from the train, but to keep the train unbroken. Well, one day, somewhere in Nebraska territory, Mother Lucy attempted to climb out of the slow-moving wagon, 3 miles per hour. She was weak from having just given birth just days before, and because of that, she slipped and fell in front of the wagon wheel. It passed right over her body, breaking 3 of her ribs in the process. Her husband, walking nearby, ran to her, grabbed her, and tried to pull her away from the wagon. But the back axle passed over her, breaking one of her legs. Well, they had to stop the wagons. The captain came running to see what was happening and quickly assessed the situation, set her leg, splinted it, and gave her a blessing, quote, assuring her that she would reach Salt Lake City in good condition, end of quote. Well, they set up a large bed in the wagon box for Lucy. And over the next several days, Lucy was confined in the wagon box as the wagon train went on. Her leg was mending well, and it was expected that she would be up soon. Then, 9 days after the incident, Lucy's daughter accidentally tripped over the leg and broke it again. This time, it was so much worse. As the wagon jolted and bounced along the trail, the pain became agonizing and unbearable. Lucy finally asked her husband to stop the wagon. He did, pulled the wagon out of the line, notwithstanding the danger, and stopped. Well, seeing the Grove's wagon pull out of the line, the captain stopped the entire train and rode up to investigate. With tears of pain coursing down her cheeks, Lucy explained the situation and urged the captain that the company go on without them. The captain replied that he would do no such thing. He would not leave any of his people behind. He stopped the train, ordered the company to make camp for the night, and then instructed some of his men to saw the legs off of Lucy's four-poster bed so that nothing remained but the laced frame. They then fastened the frame to the wagon bows, effectively forming a free swinging hammock. This done, the captain then blessed Lucy again, promising her that she would live for many years. The wagon train went on. For the next several days, this busy and harried captain rode beside Lucy's wagon to make sure that she had no further trouble. Lucy's grandson later wrote of this event, quote, "With this gentle, kind manner, Brigham Young, the wagon master, won the love of Lucy and her posterity forever." End of quote. Again, brethren, thank you to all of you who go out of your way to take care of mothers who have no one else to do it. I wanted to take just a second on a quick break and tell you again how excited I am for these little short church history tours out to Martin's Cove. Quite a number of you have signed up. If you want to go, June 14th is the first one. I'm really excited to take you out there. And I've got several people that are volunteering to help and come along who probably know the trail as well or better than I do. Don Ormsby, who's a missionary out there, and others. Thank you, all of you who have signed up to go. It's going to be a lot of fun. Now, I conclude with this next story. I share the story with permission, but the story is one of those that is so incredibly powerful that if it were not for the prompting that I received, I would never dare share it in a setting like this. It is sacred and it is powerful, and I hope that you will treat it accordingly. It is a testament to the power and influence of good mothers on both sides of the veil. It's called a true family gathering. My friend, former student, Beth, was given a challenge to go to the temple for 20 days in a row. Every day, she would be at the temple doing ordinance work for the dead. Now, she knew as a busy mother and wife that if she accepted that challenge, there was going to be serious opposition. After considering all the costs and the blessings, Beth decided that she would go ahead and accept the challenge. And she said opposition did come to a degree that even she was surprised. All the worst things that could happen at home and in the extended family seemed to come upon her like a flood. But with difficulty, Beth stayed the course to accomplish her goal and be to the temple every day. And that while doing her best to love, serve, and maintain her home and her family. She got down to the last week and invited her son and daughter to go with her to the temple one morning. When she made the invitation, she only had 2 family names. But just then, a message came, I presume through Family Search, saying that 27 names were ready for temple work. Would she accept them and do the work? Well, Quickly, Beth printed off the names. She didn't know any of them, didn't know who they were. She printed off the names, and off to the temple she and her son and daughter went. Strangely, when they got to the temple, the baptistry was empty. No one was there, and no one was coming in. The workers invited them to do the ordinances for all 27 names. Now, those of you that are temple workers or frequent attenders know how unusual this story is. Well, Mother, Beth, chose to stay in the observation area and watch as her two children, a son and a daughter, served as proxies for the dead. The elderly sister, who served at the clothing counter, had nothing else to do, so she came in to watch. There was no one needing clothing. Why not? She commented that she wondered if the reason no one was coming in was because this time had been reserved for the family whose names were being done. And Beth wondered if that could be true. Just then, while sitting in the observation area, Beth's deceased grandfather suddenly appeared sitting beside her. He smiled at her and winked, but he said nothing. As Beth's son began to baptize his sister for the dead, Beth described the following, quote, "I saw it. At the top of the font, a golden gate appeared. A lady angel came from the dark and into the light next to the gate. I watched the lady angel as my son spoke her name. When my daughter went under, an angel in front of the gate opened it, and the lady angel stepped to the other side of the gate. With an expression of tears, joy, and gratitude, the newly baptized sister suddenly disappeared and reappeared across the room, approaching another group of spirits who welcomed her with open arms of light. After the third time this had happened," Beth said, "the recorder stopped, wiped his eyes, and said, 'Do you see this? This is a true family gathering.'" Beth's son and daughter both acknowledged that they did see it. They continued, "As each baptism was performed, another spirit passed out of the darkness into the light and the arms of a welcoming family." As the names of the women were finished, Beth's son and daughter hugged each other. Beth said, "Heavenly angels were above them, and a light shone down on them in the water." There was not a dry eye among the temple workers or Beth. All could see it. Beth looked over at her grandfather, who also sat watching the proceedings. He smiled and winked, grateful that his grandchildren were worthy to do this work. Beth's son stepped down into the font, and it began again. As it had happened for the women, so too did it happen for the men. He would later describe that as each brother received the ordinance of baptism, they were in the font with him. Even with his eyes closed, he could see them, and their smiles and gratitude spoke volumes. With the completion of the ordinance, each man embraced him. When the baptisms were complete, the sister who was baptized first returned back across the room to the gate. From somewhere in the darkness, a person that Beth could not see but could hear cried, "Mom, they forgot me. I don't want to be here without you. Mom, please, I don't like it here. It scares me." Beth said she could feel the girl's fear and yearning to cross over and be with her family. The mother assured her, "No worries. I will make sure you come over quickly. I promise. I'll get right to work. You be with the missionary who is full of light. I love you, and I will get right to work. End of quote. At this point, at the conclusion of the ordinances, Beth's angel grandfather complimented her for raising children worthy to do the work and then commanded, quote, when you leave, you need to call your dad and share what has happened. He has information of who these people are. I love you, and hurry. End of quote. Beth then heard her grandfather speak to the mother at the gate. Don't worry. My granddaughter will work with you, and I'll be with your daughter. She is in good hands. End of quote. As they entered into the room to complete the ordinances of confirmation for all the newly baptized members, the same new members appeared again and were in the room, standing above the floor and watching. When Beth and her family came out of the dressing room, the baptistry began at that point, finally, to fill up with patrons the way it normally would be on a Saturday morning. It was as though that time had been reserved for just this family and that experience. The story doesn't end there. Two more wonderful events followed. The first, Beth told her father what had happened and the names of the mysterious family. As she did, his eyes filled with tears, and he explained that they were indeed her family generations back. And her grandfather was the missionary who, beyond the veil, who had found, taught, and prepared them for that day. Second event. About 1 o'clock in the morning of the very same night that this occurred, that would be early on a Sunday morning, Beth was awakened by the mother angel who had promised her daughter. Wake up, she said, we have work to do. Beth described that with only her phone and the family search app, the mother guided Beth through the keys and through all the menus and found the records that verified her daughter, her birth, and her death. Beth said by 5 o'clock in the morning, the documents were complete. The work could now be done for the missing daughter. The following Tuesday morning, the first opportunity she could, Beth was at the temple and received the ordinances for the missing daughter. Joy and peace came as Beth realized that mother and daughter were together again. Beth concluded the telling of this story to me. Quote, the promises are true. Family history and temple work and proclaiming the gospel bring about miracles. End of quote. I have another motive in sharing that story with you. Being a parent, a mother, is an eternal calling. And the love that you have for your children and those you call your children on this side of the veil will, in faith and righteousness, only become stronger, more powerful, more pure, and more perfect on the other side of the veil. What are our righteous mothers doing on the other side of the veil for the work of God and for the children and grandchildren they so love on this side of the veil? I can only imagine. My dear friends, I will see you on Wednesday. Good night, and God bless.